Section 2 of 3 Years in Europe, or Places I have Seen and People I have Met. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. 3 Years in Europe, or Places I have Seen and People I have Met, by William Wells Brown. Letter 2. Trip to Ireland, Dublin, Her Majesty's Visit, Illumination of the City, the Birthplace of Thomas More, a Reception. Dublin, August 6. After remaining in Liverpool 2 days, I took passage in the little steamer Adelaide for this city. The wind being high on the night of our voyage, the vessel had scarcely got to sea ere we were driven to our berths, and though the distance from Liverpool to Dublin is short, yet, strange to say, I witnessed more effects of the sea and rolling of the steamer upon the passengers than was to be seen during the whole of our voyage from America. We reached Kingstown, 5 miles below Dublin, after a passage of nearly 15 hours, and were soon seated on a car, and on our way to the city. While coming into the bay, one gets a fine view of Dublin and the surrounding country. Few sheets of water make a more beautiful appearance than Dublin Bay. We found it as still and smooth as a mirror, with a soft mist on its surface, a strange contrast to the boisterous sea that we had left a moment before. The curious phrases of the Irish sounded harshly upon my ear, probably because they were strange to me. I lost no time in reaching the city in seeking out some to whom I had letters of introduction, one of whom gave me an invitation to make his house my home during my stay, an invitation which I did not think fit to decline. Dublin, the metropolis of Ireland, is a city of above 200,000 inhabitants, and is considered by the people of Ireland to be the second city in the British Empire. The Liffey, which falls into Dublin Bay, a little below the Custom House, divides the town into 2 nearly equal parts. The streets are, some of them, very fine, especially Upper Sackville Street, in the centre of which stands a pillar erected to Nelson, England's most distinguished naval commander. The Bank of Ireland, to which I paid a visit, is a splendid building, and was formerly the Parliament House. This magnificent edifice fronts College Green, and near at hand stands a bronze statue of William III. The Bank and the Custom House are 2 of the finest monuments of architecture in the city, the latter of which stands near the river Liffey, and its front makes an imposing appearance, extending to 375 feet. It is built of Portland stone, and is adorned with a beautiful portico in the centre, consisting of 4 Doric columns supporting an enriched entablature decorated with a group of figures in alto relievo, representing Hibernia and Britannia, presenting emblems of peace and liberty. A magnificent dome supporting a cupola, on whose apex stands a colossal figure of Hope, rises nobly from the centre of the building to a height of 125 feet. It is, withal, a fine specimen of what man can do. From this noble edifice we bent our steps to another part of the city, and soon found ourselves in the vicinity of St. Patrick's, where we had a heart-sickening view of the poorest of the poor. All the recollections of poverty which I had ever beheld seemed to disappear in comparison with what was then before me. We passed a filthy and noisy market, where fruit and vegetable women were screaming and begging those passing by to purchase their commodities, while in and about the market place were throngs of beggars fighting for rotten fruit, cabbage, stocks, and even the very trimmings of vegetables. On the sidewalks were great numbers hovering about the doors of the more wealthy, and following strangers, importuning them for pence to buy bread. Sickly and emaciated looking creatures, half naked, were at our heels at every turn. After passing through a half dozen or more of narrow and dirty streets, we returned to our lodgings, impressed with the idea that we had seen enough of the poor for one day. In our return home, we passed through a respectable looking street in which stands a small 3-story brick building, which was pointed out to us as the birthplace of Thomas Moore, the poet. The following verse from one of Moore's poems was continually in my mind while viewing this house: "Where is the slave so lowly, condemned to chains unholy, who, could he burst his bonds at first, would pine beneath them slowly?" Yesterday was the Sabbath, but it had more the appearance of a holiday than a day of rest. It had been announced the day before that the Royal Fleet was expected, and at an early hour on Sunday the entire town seemed to be on the move towards Kingstown, and as the family with whom I was staying followed the multitude, I was not inclined to remain behind, and so went with them. On reaching the station we found it utterly impossible to get standing room in any of the trains, much less a seat, and therefore determined to reach Kingstown under the plea of a morning's walk. And in this we were not alone, for during the walk of 5 miles the road was filled with thousands of pedestrians and a countless number of carriages, phaetons, and vehicles of a more humble order. We reached the lower town in time to get a good dinner and rest ourselves before going to make further searches for Her Majesty's fleet. At a little past 4 o'clock we observed the multitude going towards the pier, a number of whom were yelling at the top of their voices, "It's coming! It's coming!" But on going to the quay we found that a false alarm had been given. However, we had been on the lookout but a short time, when a column of smoke, rising as it were out of the sea, announced that the Royal Fleet was near at hand. The concourse in the vicinity of the pier was variously estimated at from 80 to 100,000. It was not long before the 5 steamers were entering the harbour, the one bearing Her Majesty leading the way. As each vessel had a number of distinguished persons on board, the people appeared to be at a loss to know which was the Queen, and as each party made its appearance on the promenade deck, they were received with great enthusiasm, the party having the best looking lady being received with the greatest applause. The Prince of Wales and Prince Alfred, while crossing the deck, were recognized and greeted with 3 cheers. The former, taking off his hat and bowing to the people, showed that he had had some training as a public man, although not 10 years of age. But not so with Prince Alfred, for when his brother turned to him and asked him to take off his hat and make a bow to the people, he shook his head and said no. This was received with hearty laughter by those on board, and was responded to by the thousands on shore. But greater applause was yet in store for the young prince, for the captain of the steamer being near by, and seeing that the Prince of Wales could not prevail on his brother to take off his hat, stepped up to him and undertook to take it off for him, when, seemingly to the delight of all, the prince put both hands to his head and held his hat fast. This was regarded as a sign of courage and future renown, and was received with the greatest enthusiasm, many crying out, "Good! Good! He will make a brave king when his day comes." After the greetings and applause had been wasted on many who had appeared on deck, all at once, as if by some magic power, we beheld a lady rather small in stature, with auburn or reddish hair, attired in a plain dress, and wearing a sky blue bonnet, standing on the larboard paddle box, by the side of a tall, good looking man with moustaches. The thunders of applause that now rent the air, and cries of "The Queen! The Queen!" seemed to set at rest the question of which was Her Majesty. But a few moments were allowed to the people to look at the Queen, before she again disappeared, and it was understood that she would not be seen again that evening. A rush was then made for the railway to return to Dublin. August 8. Yesterday was a great day in Dublin. At an early hour the bells began their merry peals, and the people were soon seen in groups in the streets and public squares. The hour of 10 was fixed for the procession to leave Kingstown, and it was expected to enter the city at 11. The windows of the houses in the streets through which the royal train was to pass were at a premium, and seemed to find ready occupants. Being invited the day previous to occupy part of a window in Upper Sackville Street, I was stationed at my allotted place at an early hour, with an outstretched neck and open eyes. My own colour differing from those about me, I attracted not a little attention from many, and often, when gazing down the street to see if the royal procession was in sight, would find myself eyed by all around. But neither while at the window or in the streets was I once insulted. This was so unlike the American prejudice, that it seemed strange to me. It was near 12 o'clock before the procession entered Sackville Street, and when it did, all eyes seemed to beam with delight. The first carriage contained only Her Majesty and the Prince Consort; the second the royal children; and the third the lords in waiting. 15 carriages were used by those that made up the royal party. I had a full view of the Queen and all who followed in the train. Her Majesty, whether from actual love for her person or the novelty of the occasion, I know not which, was received everywhere with the greatest enthusiasm. One thing, however, is certain, and that is, Queen Victoria is beloved by her subjects. But the grand fête was reserved for the evening. Great preparations had been made to have a grand illumination on the occasion, and hints were thrown out that it would surpass anything ever witnessed in London. In this they were not far out of the way, for all who witnessed the scene admitted that it could scarcely have been surpassed. My own idea of an illumination, as I had seen it in the backwoods of my own native land, dwindled into nothing when compared with this magnificent affair. In company with a few friends and a lady under my charge, I undertook to pass through Sackville and one or two other streets about 8 o'clock in the evening, but we found it utterly impossible to proceed. Masses thronged the streets, and the wildest enthusiasm seemed to prevail. In our attempt to cross the bridge, we were wedged in and lost our companions, and on one occasion I was separated from the lady, and took shelter under a cart standing in the street. After being jammed and pulled about for nearly 2 hours, I returned to my lodgings, where I found part of my company who had come in one after another. At 11 o'clock we had all assembled, and each told his adventures and hairbreadth escapes, and nearly every one had lost a pocket handkerchief or something of the kind. My own was among the missing. However, I lost nothing, for a benevolent lady, who happened to be one of the company, presented me with one which was of far more value than the one I had lost. Every one appeared to enjoy the holiday which the royal visit had caused, but the Irish are indeed a strange people. How varied their aspect, how contradictory their character! Ireland, the land of genius and degradation, of great resources and unparalleled poverty, noble deeds and the most revolting crimes, the land of distinguished poets, splendid orators, and the bravest of soldiers, the land of ignorance and beggary. Dublin is a splendid city, but its splendour is that of chiselled marble rather than real life. One cannot behold these architectural monuments without thinking of the great men that Ireland has produced. The names of Burke, Sheridan, Flood, Grattan, O'Connell, and Shiel have become as familiar to the Americans as household words. Burke is known as the statesman, Sheridan for his great speech on the trial of Warren Hastings, Grattan for his eloquence, O'Connell as the agitator, and Shiel as the accomplished orator. But of Ireland's sons, none stands higher in America than Thomas Moore the poet. The vigour of his sarcasm, the glow of his enthusiasm, the coruscations of his fancy, and the flashing of his wit seem to be as well understood in the New World as the Old, and the support which his pen has given to civil and religious liberty throughout the world, entitled the Minstrel of Erin to this elevated position. Before leaving America, I had heard much of the friends of my enslaved countrymen residing in Ireland, and the reception I met with on all hands while in public, satisfied me that what I had heard had not been exaggerated. To the Webbs, Allens, and Houghtons of Dublin, the cause of the American slave is much indebted. I quitted Dublin with a feeling akin to leaving my native land. End of Letter 2. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista.